In the early decades of the Norman monarchy, kings had vast lands they could distribute liberally to loyal followers, but by the time of the first Plantagenets, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John, these lands were much reduced. How did they pay for war?
I am having to jump back and forth among the later years of the 12th century to prepare viewers for the main event, the reign of King John and Magna Carta. In the Middle Ages, as now, everything depended on money. Nothing changes. The cost of running a medieval country was enormous, especially one engaged in so much war as English kings were. It's been calculated that the Crown's ordinary annual revenue was about £26,000 from traditional sources: royal lands, wardship and marriage, profits of justice, imports and exports, particularly of wool, fines or amercements. By the time John came to the throne in 1199, ordinary revenue is a misnomer, because extraordinary revenue had been required to satisfy the needs of Henry II, and particularly those of the Lionheart. Special circumstances had become commonplace. The problem with royal lands was that since the time of the Conqueror in the 11th century, much of these had been passed out of the Crown, mostly by grants to followers or to buy support. Sales accounted for some losses of property. Some land came back by forfeiture or escheat. Escheat is a term for want of an heir. It may interest British viewers to hear that escheat is still known to the law and comes into action when a person dies intestate without any known heirs. There is a whole department in the British Treasury known as the Treasury Solicitor Bona Vacantia. Bona Vacantia is a Latin term meaning vacant goods. So the Treasury can claim the asset and sell it for cash. The Lionheart had sold so much Crown land to fund his crusade to the Holy Land that by the time of John's accession in 1199, revenue of £2,000 a year had been lost from Crown property and passed into private hands. By the end of the 12th century, there was also the Great Inflation, in which prices had risen by 2 or 3 times as much as in the reign of King Henry II, who died 10 years before. The medieval mind had no conception of inflation. Other than for special items such as Richard the Lionheart's ransom, it was expected that a king would live of his own. This expression is found in the writings of the great 17th century lawyer Sir Edward Coke, when the early Stuart kings, James I and Charles I, were also expected to live of their own. Charles I's reign ended in the cataclysm of a desperate civil war, the king's execution and the declaration of a republic. There is a clear parallel with the baronial plots in the early 13th century that compassed the assassination or deposition of King John before Magna Carta. I love the expression "to compass the death of the king," which seems to have originated in the 14th century. By 1355, even to think of killing the king became treasonable by Act of Parliament. King John is sometimes known as John Lackland, and the epithet is wrongly attributed to him for the loss of the lands in France in the first years of his reign. He had been known as Lackland as a child, since he had not received very much in the way of manors and estates compared with his older siblings. This was unwisely put right by his brother Richard the Lionheart when he became king in 1189. Henry II had in fact made his youngest son Lord of Ireland and had him crowned King of Ireland in 1177. In 1185, Prince John, as King of Ireland, crossed over to his new fief, no doubt to see what could be made from it financially. Not much had changed since the English invasion of 1169, and when John arrived 16 years later, English rule was hardly consolidated, except around Dublin, where an area known as the Pale had been established. The word Pale comes from the word palisade. Ireland was not conquered for centuries, and any man going there was expected to take whatever he could at the point of his sword. On arrival, not very surprisingly, John thought it fit to shut up everything in his own purse, and was unwilling to pay the wages of his soldiers, according to one of the chroniclers at the time. This reduced the number of his troops rapidly, so he made some local dispositions of those knights who would stand their ground and went back to England, presumably with most of the money. 20 years had still to pass before John became king, and he was already known for his intense avarice, in a family noted for this mortal sin. This is a trifle unfair considering the state of Ireland at the time. As Henry II's sons grew up, they quarrelled with each other and with their father. First, the eldest son Henry was crowned by his father in 1170 and was known as the Young King. He ended in rebellion against his father. The young king died of dysentery in 1183. In 1185, Richard, later the Lionheart, seized his brother Geoffrey, made Duke of Brittany by the king. The Duke had failed to return some property to their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry II had to intervene to restore the peace. In 1188, the king arrived at Le Mans, capital of Maine, and ordered everyone to make over a tenth of his revenues in that year towards his proposed crusade, a project, of course, that the king was far too old to undertake. He was backed by the church, whose prelates threatened to excommunicate anyone who failed to make his contribution. Similarly, anyone who was in debt, who volunteered for the crusade, was exempted from interest payments so long as he was going on crusade. But officials never looked too closely into this, so long as the king and they received a consideration for their trouble. There is an excellent example from September 1189 of how profitable royal excuse from the crusade could be. Roger of Howden wrote,
King of England, sending his envoys to Pope Clement, obtained from him letters patent that such persons as he should think fit to excuse from crusade and leave in charge of his dominions should be exempt from assuming the cross and proceeding to Jerusalem, by which means he obtained an immense sum of money.
It was evidently a money spinner. Similar exemptions for cash or for favour were granted to conscripted men in the First and Second World Wars under colour of a medical disability or being in a reserved occupation. A tenth of the value of all property was taken by Henry II in England in 1188. The king sent his officials and clerks throughout the land, causing all the richest men in York, London and the biggest towns and cities to attend on certain days with the money in specie. If any failed to show up, they were sought, clapped in irons and imprisoned until the last farthing had been wrung from them. King Philip of France carried out a similar exercise in his own territories. He was also joining the crusade.
When Richard the Lionheart succeeded as King of England in 1189, his brother Prince John was the greatest recipient of earldoms, lands and manors and the county of Mortain in France. He needed a vast stack of gold and silver if he was to fund his crusade to Jerusalem, 2,000 miles away, and the cost of getting there.